so that we can get going. All right, here we go. Welcome, everybody. I am Colleen Hitchcock on behalf of the Swampscott Conservancy. I just wanted to welcome everybody to this evening's event. Before we get going with our main affair, I just want to take a minute to orient those of you who might be new to us at the Conservancy as to who we are and what we do. So the Swampscott Conservancy is a small place-based nonprofit located here in Swampscott, Massachusetts. I'm adding in the Massachusetts because I see we have some international flair this evening in the chat. So just to make sure that everybody knows where we are coming from. As I already mentioned, this event is being recorded. Please remain muted until the end of the session and we will open it up for a Q&A. Also, once our speaker begins, we ask that you please turn your video off so that our recording keeps only the speaker's video active at that point. So the Swampscott Conservancy, who are we? Again, we are a small place-based nonprofit here in Swampscott, Massachusetts. We take a four-pronged approach to conservation activities here in town. We do lots of education activities and education for all ages, from family ed events to adult education events like this evening. We do some citizen science activities, from monitoring with iNaturalist to MyCoast to look at sea level rise and king tides. We also participate and take action in habitat restoration. And for those who haven't visited our native pollinator garden down at Town Hall, we encourage you to do so, or to check out the Forest Trail Connector out by the dog park, which now connects you over into Salem, into Salem's conservation areas as well. And of course, we're all about connecting with one another as a community through in-person and our virtual events. We encourage you to please get involved with us, whether it's through our face-to-face activities or our education activities. We are currently within our 2022 membership drive. So if you have not yet renewed your membership, please do. And there's other ways to support us in addition to monetary contributions. We also have some swag for sale, and since I am wearing it, I'm going to go ahead and lean back. So here is one of our bonfire designs, this one featuring native plants are in fact the bomb, and we hope that you will agree by the end. I will place that link in the chat in just a little bit. And with that, I am, oh, sorry, one more acknowledgement. I just also want to acknowledge Brandeis University for use of their Zoom in supporting this event, and the rest of our support is coming directly from the Conservancy this evening. And with that, I'm going to hand things over and introduce our speaker for this evening. And so we are joined by Evan Abramson for designing biodiversity in the Anthropocene, creating landscapes and corridors to support wild pollinators. Evan is a results-driven designer and planner on a mission to rebuild biologically diverse ecosystems through pollinator-plant interactions. He's founder and principal of Landscape Interactions and works closely with project partners from concept through design to implement designs that are supporting native pollinators. Opened in 2019, Landscape Interactions has been responsible for nearly 200 acres of habitat installed in the Northeast, specifically targeting at-risk bee and butterfly species for each project location. We're looking forward to learning more about Landscape Interactions work and what we can take away here locally in Swampscott. And so Evan, with that, I'm going to stop sharing and hand the reins over to you. And if everybody could please turn off their video at this point, that would be super.
Thank you, Colleen. And thank you all for joining tonight. I'm going to talk to you all about why pollinator habitat is so important, how it's connected to biodiversity networks as a whole, and how it serves to support responding to a changing climate, and then give some examples of some of our work from a couple of different projects across the Northeast. So I like to start off by talking about, the time period that we're living in today. Humanity has impacted the earth in such a profound way that a new geological epoch has been declared. The age of the Anthropocene is defined by a striking acceleration of carbon dioxide emissions and sea level rise, as well as the global mass extinction of species and the transformation of land and waters across the planet. And currently, as many as 30 to 50% of all species on the planet are heading toward extinction by the middle of this century. So within the next 30 or so years, if we don't turn things around. What that essentially implies is that we're facing a collapse of nature as we know it. 1 million species are threatened with extinction globally, including over half of the native bee species in North America. Insects are essential for all ecosystems, not only as pollinators, but also as food for other creatures and recyclers of nutrients. And at the current rate of decline, insects could vanish within a century. The main reason for this is loss of natural habitat. That is also closely followed by all the different insecticides and pesticides that have been developed and are being used, especially neonicotinoids, which have really come to the forefront in the last 20 years. To quote one scientist from the peer-reviewed journals I have listed here at the bottom right, we are essentially sleepwalking towards the edge of a cliff. There's also a crisis in North America specifically regarding birds. We've lost 3 billion birds since 1970, which is over 1 in 4 birds in the last 50 years. And again, habitat loss is the most direct cause. So you can see how as we move across trophic levels, going from insects to birds, we're really facing the same challenges. It's really a loss of natural lands and natural ecosystems that's affecting these species. According to the UN, the 5 biggest threats to biodiversity globally are, in order of importance: number 1, changes in land and sea use. Number 2, exploitation of natural resources such as mining, logging. Number 3, climate change, pollution, and invasive species. So this graphic here on the right really illustrates all of these points in more specific terms, but essentially we're just hitting insects and animals on all sides, everything from disruptions by temperature, disruptions by wildfire, flooding, droughts, etc., pesticides, industrial agriculture. But at the same time, climate and biodiversity are really intricately linked, and you really can't solve one without solving the other. It's not really about climate change impacting biodiversity or climate change making species go extinct. It's actually the loss of biodiversity makes the climate crisis worse, because connected, diverse ecosystems actually help stabilize the climate. And they have a better chance at surviving and thriving in a world where there's so many uncertainties, whether it's temperature swings, flooding, drought, what have you. With a more diverse landscape, with more diverse plant and animal species, that landscape has a better chance at bouncing back in the event of a disturbance, such as a wildfire, as in this graphic. So rather than being framed as a victim of climate change, we should really be thinking about biodiversity as one of the main solutions. Now, looking specifically at land cover, grasslands, which include things like meadows, as we call them around here, they actually hold 20% of global carbon stocks, as well as 1/3 of the world's land-based carbon. So contrary to what many people think, grasslands are essential in the carbon sequestration solution. It's not just about forests. Now, looking at the Midwest United States, so many grasslands have given way to crops like corn and soybeans that currently US agriculture is about 10% of our country's annual emissions. And in a 2019 study, they found that tillage for cropland expansion put as much carbon dioxide in the air per year as 31 million cars. Another study from the year before found that by conserving grasslands in the US, that could prevent almost 3 times as much carbon emissions as conserving forests. And in the temperate parts of the world, which includes North America and Europe, we've actually lost half of our grasslands, or half of our native grasslands, whereas something like the Amazon rainforest, only about 20% have been lost. So just some numbers to consider. A study from the University of California, Davis found that grasslands and rangelands are actually more resilient carbon sinks than forests in a scenario that we're facing now in places like California because of all the wildfires. So unlike forests, when grasslands burn, they don't release that much carbon. Most of their carbon is stored underground, which you can see illustrated in this image on the right of Indian grass, which is a native warm season bunching grass that's also found in Massachusetts. So, you think about trees, they burn, well, that carbon's gone forever, whereas with grasses and perennial flowers, native flowers, grasses and sedges, it's actually stored underground. And that's why prescribed fire is actually a recommended landscape restoration strategy in places like the Northeast and the Midwest, when you're looking at reestablishing native plant communities in open areas that are not forested. Here's a graphic of some of the root systems of native herbaceous plants. So here, actually on the left is the one outlier. This is non-native. This is Kentucky bluegrass. So this is what is typically in most lawns. You can see here the root depth is about 2 inches. Now over here towards the middle, this is one of our native asters, heath aster. It's got a root depth of about 8 or 9 feet. And then over here is switchgrass. That is another native warm season grass, and that has a root depth of approximately 12 feet. And then lastly, on the far right, another example is little bluestem, another warm season native grass, an important host plant, as well as switchgrass for a lot of at-risk Lepidoptera in Massachusetts and the Northeast. And that's got a root depth of about 7 feet. So it's really incredible how much is going on underground that we don't really notice. Like take a plant like little bluestem, it's only about 3 or 4 feet above the ground, but it's almost double that, or if more than double that underground. One myth about grasses, shrubs, and flowers is regarding where they pull water from under the soil. So grasses, whether they're native or not, they tend to pull water from the top area of the soil, maybe the top 6 to 10 or 12 inches. Whereas native flowers, or flowers in general, which are forbs, they pull water within the first 30 inches. In contrast, shrubs, woody shrubs and other woody plants will pull water from as deep as 8 to 10 feet or more, especially if it's a tree, it's much more. So having a diversity of grasses, native sedges, native flowers, and shrubs in a landscape, it really creates a more resilient landscape, as full as ability to pull water when there's a drought event, when it hasn't rained for a few weeks or months, or to even cycle nutrients and move nutrients through the soil. And these plants really work together in that way, especially with mycorrhizal fungi. So essentially, what we're proposing is to redesign nature in this age of the Anthropocene that I've described in simple terms. I see farms, conservation properties, suburban and urban greenways, as well as rural communities, really providing a wealth of opportunities for expanding regional biodiversity, resilience to climate change, as well as ecological health and local food security, specifically through the implementation of pollinator habitat. What happens or doesn't happen at the pollination scale has repercussions all the way up the food chain and through the food web, as you can see here, to the largest predators and humans. So why are pollinators so important? Well, pollinators are primarily insects, although not exclusively, that fertilize plants producing seeds and fruit. They're responsible for assisting over 80% of the world's flowering plants. Without pollinators, over 80% of the flowering plants on Earth would not exist. And bees alone pollinate nearly half of the food crops grown in Massachusetts, as well as a third of the food grown in the United States. Pollinators are essential to creating and maintaining the habitats and ecosystems that most animals rely upon. And some plants depend specifically on a small group of pollinators, whether at the species, genus, or family scale, to pollinate them. And approximately 15% of northeastern native bees are pollen specialists, meaning that they only pollinate a small group of plants at the family or genus level. So what are the needs of a native bee when we're considering them in restoring a landscape or creating a landscape design? Well, there's about 4,000 native bee species in the United States, and over 400 of them are found in Massachusetts and the Northeast. Native bees do the vast majority of pollination. In a global study of 40 food crops in 600 unique fields across every populated continent, it was found that wild pollinators were twice as effective as honeybees in producing seeds and fruit. And that citation to that study is here at the bottom. It's Garibaldi et al. So anyone that makes the argument that we need honeybees for our food production is largely mistaken. It's really native pollinators that are doing the lion's share of the work. The average foraging range of a native bee in the Northeast is really just an average of 200 to 1,800 feet from their nest site. So it's really important to have landscape connectivity across a property or across a town or across a region, because they won't get from one place to the other without that. 70% of native bee species in the Northeast nest underground. Most are solitary. They're not living in a hive or any sort of social network. And other examples of their habitat include bare ground, soft pithed twigs, abandoned rodent burrows, dead trees, and snags. So those are all opportunities for pollinators on our landscapes. And those are all things that we can consider when we're doing a design. Right here is a graphic taken from one of our projects in the town of Lincoln. We mapped here 6 sites that already had habitat installed as part of the project. And we showed the proximity of those sites to each other insofar as the average range of a native bee is concerned. So you can see here that this is the average, not the maximum, but the average foraging range of a bumblebee, for example, in this graphic is represented in yellow, whereas a mason bee is in blue and a sweat bee, which is a small solitary bee, is in pink. So, even though some of these properties are neighboring or on the same street, it's only in the case where they're really within less than 1,000 feet from each other that you have this overlap. And that's why it's so important to work together, with your neighbors in a community to all just do a little something for pollinators if you want to create a corridor and you really want to, try to create an opportunity for species to move from place to place. Regarding food, I really like to emphasize, just how important bumblebees are to our food crops. You can see here the genus Bombus, which is at the top of the list. Those are bumblebees. They not only do they pollinate so many native plants, including things like maple and willow and redbud, but they're also pollinating apples, blueberries, tomatoes, eggplants, and melons. And in fact, only bumblebees pollinate tomatoes and eggplants in most cases, although there are some cases where honeybees can do some of that pollination. It's usually bumblebees, and bumblebees are doing a lot more. So they're important, not just for our ecological systems, but for our food systems. Other significant pollinators in places like Massachusetts include the ruby-throated hummingbird, the Aphrodite fritillary. That's an example of a butterfly that's at risk in Massachusetts, meaning at risk of extirpation. Their only known host plant are native violets. So if there's no violets on a site, they won't be there. The monarch butterfly, they're known pretty well because they're in decline globally, over 80% population decline, and they only lay their eggs on milkweed. But in Massachusetts, they're actually a stable population. They're not at risk, specifically in the Northeast. And then another example of an at-risk species in the Northeast and in Massachusetts is the Dion skipper, which only inhabit sedge wetlands and marshes and swamps. So, depending upon your site, where it's located and what kind of soil and habitat you already have or you're adjacent to, you might target different species for that project, and therefore you would plant different plants. Many people are familiar with honeybee decline. It's called colony collapse disorder, and I just want to, shed a little light on that. So in 1980, there were about 4.5 million honeybee colonies in the US. Fast forward to 2005, we had half the amount. The main reasons are widely considered to be: number one, loss of habitat. So same thing affecting native bees and birds, followed by pesticides and climate change. However, since 2005, beehive populations in the US have actually been increasing, as you can see from this graphic. And a lot of that is because there's been so much money, millions of dollars put into this at the federal level, and even from private corporations, companies like Monsanto, Syngenta. A lot of these pesticide companies are actually supporting honeybee health because they got so much bad press about it. Well, what about native bees? This map here is showing the abundance of wild bee species in the US in a 5-year period beginning in 2010. And it's found in the study that wild bee abundance dropped by 23% in 5 years, which is shocking. I mean, that's a 1/4 loss in a 5-year period. This map here shows the areas that have the highest wild bee abundance in blue, the areas that have the lowest abundance in yellow. It's no coincidence that the areas that are in yellow are the parts of the United States that are using the most pesticides, because you can see on this graphic here, this is estimated agricultural use of one type of neonicotinoid pesticide in just 1 year, 2014. So it's really incredible. You go back and forth between these two graphics, it's almost exactly the same. Areas with the lowest abundance of wild bees are areas with the highest use of pesticides and insecticides. And, it's also the areas that have the greatest population density, places like New York City and, Miami, Los Angeles. These are areas, Chicago, these are the areas that, not only on farms, but even on our landscapes, on our parks, around our buildings and schools. So many people are unknowingly using these pesticides just because they think it's part of a standard land care practice. And that's really an awareness that needs to change. And thankfully in Massachusetts, they've put some limits on the sale of neonicotinoids. I believe you need a pesticide applicator's license to buy them now. Looking at the issue of honeybees and native bees and whether competition exists, right here is just a list of a few peer-reviewed journals, and I've pulled some quotes from them that I'll share with you today. So conserving honeybees does not help wildlife. These are direct quotes from the articles. Local bumblebee decline linked to the recovery of honeybees. Honeybees negatively affect the abundance of both long and short-tongued bumblebees, indicating that competition occurs. And I think the first one is also important. 40 hives for 3 months collects the pollen equivalent of 4 million wild bees. So really, honeybees outcompete native bees as well as other insects, including hoverflies, march flies, and other flower visiting insects. And they really should not be on conservation properties or wildlands. Honeybees should be restricted to, in my opinion, urban areas, or even more so, farms, productive landscapes where people are specifically looking to pollinate annual food crops or perhaps fruit trees. But putting out honeybee hives on a large conservation property or anything along those lines at the edge of a forest, at the edge of a field, that's really not a good thing. It's actually damaging to native pollination systems. It's like raising chickens to save the birds. So raising honeybees does not help pollinators in decline. It simply actually adds more fuel to the fire. And in the same way, raising chickens is not going to save the bird crisis. They're totally different systems. They're totally different networks that don't really have anything to do with each other. However, in the case of honeybees, they actually outcompete the native pollinators. So beyond pollinator friendly, the reason why I have talked about all this up until this point in the presentation is because most efforts to create pollinator habitat or restore pollination systems, as we call it, have unfortunately focused on increasing the numbers of just a handful of bee species and perhaps butterfly species, rather than the range of wild pollinators necessary for ecosystem health and resiliency. And what I would like to really drive home here is that seeing lots of bees does not mean that your landscape is pollinator friendly. It could all be one or two species of common bees, such as honeybees or the common eastern bumblebee. There are so many more bees and pollinators out there that we want to be seen on our projects. And in order to do that, you have to change your plant selection. You have to select plants that are going to support those at-risk pollinators. Globally, there's about 300 species of flowering plants and 200,000 species, unique species of animal pollinators. So I mean, that's nearly a 1-to-1 ratio. And a major misconception about pollinator decline is that all pollinators are declining at the same rate. Many pollinator species are actually at higher numbers now than they were historically. They're actually benefiting from things like climate change and land use changes. And right here's a video that illustrates that point. So here in this video, you see a bottle gentian flower. And this is a native long-tongued bumblebee, Bombus vagans, which is one of the bumblebee species that is at risk of no longer existing in Massachusetts, forcing its way into the flower in order to reach the nectar reward at the base of the flower. Now, the only thing that can pollinate this flower, this bottle gentian, is a long-tongued bumblebee. Number one, because only bumblebees are large enough and strong enough to force their way into the closed flower. Other smaller solitary bees can't do that. Secondly, only long-tongued bumblebees can reach the nectar reward at the bottom. And when they do that, they become covered with pollen. They get so much nectar that the next thing that they do is they look for a flower of the same species because they want more of that. And that's how that flower has evolved over millions of years to ensure its own reproduction. That's an example of a specialized relationship between a pollinator and a plant. So let's look at the difference between diversity and abundance. In Massachusetts, we've got about 11 bumblebee species, historically. I mean, there's a few more, but some of them are incredibly rare. But in terms of bumblebee species that were historically or currently found in numbers large enough to be studied, there's 11 species. Of those 11, 2 are extirpated. They no longer are found in the state, and that is Bumbus affinis and Bumbus pennsylvanicus. Those are both on the federal endangered species list. Now, we also have another 2 species that are expected to be gone within this decade. That's Bombus vagans and Bombus fervidus. So if we don't do something, within the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to have 4 species that are extirpated from Massachusetts. Now, you look at these graphics here, and this is from data that was collected by Dr. Robert Jagir at UMass Dartmouth. Historically, the bars in gold. In low elevation areas of the state, which includes the Swampscott area and really largely all of eastern Massachusetts, and all the way up to the Worcester Plateau, historically, there were about 9 species of bumblebees that were found commonly in pretty large numbers, 8 to 9 species. Nowadays, it's really just 1, it's Bombus impatiens. And if you're lucky, you might happen to see a little bit of the other 3 or 4. In high elevation areas of the state, historically, there were 3 species that were in very large numbers, and then another 4 to 5 species that were found in lower numbers. Today, it's again, mostly Bombus impatiens as well as Bombus griseicollis. Now, Bombus impatiens and Bombus griseicollis were never historically found in the high elevation areas of the state. The reason why they're there now is because they're escaping low elevation areas. They can't find the plants that they want or need. And they're going into the high elevation areas. They're taking over the niches of these other pollinators that used to be the most common species in the high elevation areas. So lots of bees is not always a good thing. What really matters is which species are showing up. And if you have a diversity of species, and if you're attracting species that are in decline, you're doing a good thing for pollinator habitat restoration. And then looking at other bee groups, solitary bees, butterflies, and moths, Mass Wildlife lists 5 more bee species and 44 butterfly and moth species as species of greatest conservation need. And every year, more and more species are being added to that list. Those are the species that we're targeting on our projects, not common species like bumbus impatiens, and certainly not honeybees. Essentially, diversity of species, whether plant or animal, hopefully both, is resilience. That will be the resilient landscape that will survive climate change and disruptions, because animal and plant species diversity equals ecological resiliency. And it's a diverse combination of that that will allow a landscape to survive in the event of a disturbance like a fire, a drought, flooding, and temperature swings. Looking at native plant communities in the Northeast, currently about 22% of New England's native plant taxa are either globally, regionally, or locally imperiled. And there was a study that was done in Concord, Massachusetts by Richard Primack, and he compared observations of flowers by the likes of Henry David Thoreau and others in the early 20th century. And he found that approximately 27% of species that had been recorded were no longer present, and 36% of formerly common species were now rare. And many of these species are only in small populations, even just a few individuals. So we're facing not only pollinator loss, but a plant community loss. And that's why we advocate for restoring both in our landscapes, not just one. Another study which is important is researchers at the University of New Hampshire and over in Canada found that a 94% of plant pollinator networks in northern New England had been lost over the past 125 years. That means either the plant, the pollinator, or both are no longer out there in the wild on the landscape. And they concluded that conservation efforts should be focused specifically on restoring habitat for declining wild bee and plant species. So again, the science tells us we need to plant plants that support pollinators in decline. We need to plant plants that are in decline. We can't keep planting the same common plants over and over and over again. It's not going to change anything. And we're essentially running out of time. Small isolated populations, whether plants or of animals, are likely to get caught in what's considered an extinction vortex of catastrophes, meaning a small population size doesn't have a lot of genetic diversity, there becomes inbreeding, and then eventually the species goes extinct. And that's why we advocate for planting rare plants and plants that are less common in order to build back those natural ecosystems, not only for pollinators, but also for the plant communities. Now I'm going to zip through this a bit because it's pretty detailed, but there's a phrase I like to use, which is letting the perfect get in the way of the good. There's a big movement nowadays to only plant native plants that are of a local ecotype, meaning that the seeds or the plant stock were collected from your exact geographical region. And the reality is that those plants are not really available, and they're certainly not available in large scale quantities, especially if you're going for seeds, as we do on a lot of our sites, but they're not even really available in plants either. So I've put together this little tutorial to sort of illustrate why that's not always necessary or even a good idea. So right here, this is a map of the seed transfer zones that were created by the US Forest Service. It's basically an area within which plant materials can be transferred with little risk of being poorly adapted. So you can basically plant something, whether it's a seed or a plant, that's from the same seed transfer zone, and be assured that it will do fine. It will have similar rainfall, it will have similar climate over the year. So you can see here on the left, this area, which is the border between Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Illinois, it's called the driftless area. And the reason why I'm pointing it out is there happen to be a lot of native plant nurseries located there, including Prairie Nursery and Prairie Moon Nursery. Now, ecologically, the driftless area, even though it's located in the upper Midwest, it's actually got flora and fauna that are more closely related to New England than those of the Midwest and Central Plains. So zooming in a bit, here's Prairie Moon Nursery, just one example of a nursery located in that area. And you can see it's got the same exact color as parts of the Northeast on the right. Over here is Ernst Seeds. They're a well-known seed supplier located in Western Pennsylvania. And they've also got a seed transfer zone in red, which is similar to parts of Eastern Massachusetts. And over here on the top right is Wild Seed Project in Portland, Maine. So here's 3 of our project sites. And this really just illustrates the nuances that you have when you're designing in a place like the Northeast. So Keene, New Hampshire, seed transfer zone similar to Prairie Moon. Lincoln, Massachusetts, same seed transfer zone as Ernst. And Leiden, Massachusetts, where I'm based, same seed transfer zone as really none of them, as we will soon see. So here's Prairie Moon, seed transfer zone, and here's Keene. They're exactly the same. Ernst, same thing, same as Lincoln. Now we get to Wild Seed Project. Their seed transfer zone is classified as 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, less than 2 centimeters of average rainfall, and Leiden, 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, less than 2 centimeters rainfall. So while Wild Seed Project might be the closest to this site in Leiden, it's not the same, and it's really no more similar than Prairie Moon. And my point in this is you can't really get local ecotype seeds and plants on the Eastern Seaboard nowadays. So these are, this is from a study that was done by the Mid-Atlantic Regional Seed Bank. They found that availability of species, native species in the seed form, local ecotype, poor availability largely across the Eastern Seaboard, as in the bottom right, and same thing with plants. You can get native species, yes, that's better. If you look at the top graphics, there's more availability of native species than there is of native species of local ecotypes. So the point is, true local ecotype native seeds and plants are difficult to obtain. You can't use rare plants from out of state if you're doing a restoration project that has to be certified by state agencies. So like if you're doing a project that the NHESP or Mass Wildlife has a say over, they will not let you use rare plants. However, from out of state. However, you're not allowed to collect seeds from rare plants without a permit, and those permits are difficult to obtain. They tend to only offer them to, like licensed or certified botanists, people working for agencies, organizations like the Native Plant Trust. But at the same time, at-risk pollinators, like the pollinators that we really need to target if we're going to help pollinators not go extinct, they like rare plants. They tend to visit those rare plants, as I'll talk about a little bit later. And the question is, do pollinators care where the seeds or plants come from? The answer is no. And there's no research that I know of, or anyone that I've spoken to knows of, that has shown that a pollinating species will prefer, let's say, a Penstemon hirsutus from a seed that was, collected in the same state where that pollinator has a nest, than a Penstemon hirsutus that was from a different state or a different part of the United States. If it's the same species, they don't care where the seeds or plants come from. So what are the consequences of our current restoration strategies? Essentially, plants and pollinators are on their way towards extinction if we don't start planting these rare plants, whether or not they're of local ecotypes. So essentially, this is what I think matters the most. Plant native plants, not cultivars, hybrids, or non-natives. Don't plant pollinator habitat in areas that are contaminated by pesticides. Ensure that the plants and seeds you're buying are from a clean, pesticide-free source. Many commercial nurseries treat their seeds and plants with neonicotinoids. And if you're planting milkweed for butterflies, make sure it's a native variety, not a tropical variety. If you're creating bee housing for things like, please don't draw on my slide. If you're providing bee housing, be sure to check it and clean it for parasites and pathogens every year. And really, the best bee housing is just native landscapes with exposed soil for ground nesting pollinators and plenty of dead wood, abandoned rodent burrows and the like. You really don't need to create bee housing. So here, we're going to look at some case studies now that illustrate some of these concepts in practice. So the Lincoln Pollinator Action Plan is a corridor project that we did in the town of Lincoln, Massachusetts, essentially a roadmap for biodiversity and climate resilience. The project was informed by design. So unlike a lot of other landscape design projects, we're actually using scientific research on a site-by-site basis to determine which plants we should plant and which pollinators we're targeting. To measure the success of the project, we are studying our case study sites in Lincoln over a 3-year period. We're doing the before and after. Which native bumblebee and butterfly species were on the site before we did any planting or changed anything, and which ones arrived as a result. Essentially attempting to improve the functional diversity of the landscapes over time. And the project has had a huge impact. In just the first year, before the final plan was even published, 250 people attended various programs that the Lincoln Land Trust offered around the plan. 98 planting kits were sold, meaning plants that were recommended by our team for planting in Lincoln to support at-risk pollinators were purchased by 98 different people and families and installed on their own private landscapes, which is nearly 2,000 plants distributed, representing over 12 towns in Massachusetts and beyond. And we have 2 target bumblebee species and 10 at-risk Lepidoptera. So here's a map on the left of Lincoln, and you can see here in dark pink are our 4 toolkit sites. Those were sites in Lincoln that we created site-specific landscape designs for that are meant to be scaled and replicated across the town and across the region. And the properties that are in lighter pink here are sites where the same plants and habitat management recommendations were implemented by private landowners in the town. So just putting a 500-foot buffer on each of these properties, which represents the average foraging range of a native bee species, you can see here the opportunities for connectivity. And this is just what was installed the first year of the project. The project's already going into its 3rd year. As I mentioned, we're studying those 4 toolkit sites over a 3-year period, essentially showing the before and after impacts of the designs. And here's our list of at-risk pollinators that are supported by the Lincoln Pollinator Action Plan. So we've got over 10, I think we have 3, 6, 9, about 14 or 15 at-risk butterfly species and 4 at-risk bumblebee species. Here's the recommended plant list for Lincoln. And you guys over in Swampscott should certainly be using the same exact plants on your projects. I recommend that anyone who's living in Northeast Massachusetts, just Google and download the Lincoln Pollinator Action Plan if you want to do anything for pollinators in your town or on your site, because you've got all the plants listed right here and you've got all the different habitat design and landscape management recommendations you could possibly need, including mowing regimes. Our 4 toolkit sites in Lincoln represented the following types of landscapes. We had a meadow and woodland edge site. We had an old field site, which was basically an abandoned sheep pasture, a wet meadow site or a wetland, and a garden and lawn site. So that really covers the gamut as far as typical landscapes found in places like Eastern Massachusetts, although as you get further south, you go into some other coastal habitats. But largely speaking, this should really be applicable for most people that are not living directly on the coast. This is our first, so the first toolkit site in Lincoln was the Meadow and Woodland Toolkit. So first we analyzed the existing conditions of the site. This is just one of the analyses we did. And then we came up with the final design. And this essentially is a design for a small meadow here inside the rectangle with mowed paths, a meandering path with some large boulders for sitting or resting, and then intricate path system around the meadow, which is basically a woodland edge type of landscape that includes all kinds of native bunching grasses, sedges, shrubs, trees, and flowers. And right here is the, right here is the planting list for that design. And it's drawing from the same plants that are in the planting list that I already shared. And all of this is available in the Lincoln Pollinator Action Plan, which you can download online for free. So As far as plants, we're working with things like native willows, scrub oak, or really any oak, any native oak, Atlantic white cedar, redbud, buttonbush, northern bush honeysuckle, St. John's wort, native roses, purple flowering raspberry, blackberries, meadowsweet, cranberry, blueberry, big blue stem, little blue stem, switchgrass, native sedges, thistles, Joe pieweed, Canadian wood betony, which is Pedicularis canadensis, Prunella vulgaris, violets. So, and then we've got a seed mix for the meadow. So really what this sort of a design is doing is it's creating a human experience here where you can have, this aesthetically pleasing experience, but it's essentially providing a landscape that supports a very, very diverse, wide range of not only bees, but also butterflies and even moths. And although the moth data is still really being studied for the first time in the last few years, as far as what is actually at risk, in most cases, we don't know. Things like oaks and willows and sedges and grasses, they really support a lot of moths as well as butterflies as far as host plants. The Oldfield Toolkit, as I mentioned, it's for a former sheep pasture. It's an 8-acre site. And, this is just, again, another example of some of the analyses that we do on all of our projects. We look at existing conditions. We look at slopes and drainage on the top right, and we look at sun and shade across the growing season, bottom right. And then, we do more than that, but we do botanical surveys, and then we basically come up with a design that suits the needs of the landowner or the client. And here's our final design for the site. So in order to accomplish this design, which is largely in yellow, an upland seed mix, along with groupings of, bunching grasses, flowers, shrubs, and trees, the entire site first had to be cleared of all the existing non-native grasses, which dominated it. And in order to do that, we recommended in the plan that they burn the field and then seed drill it. And I was happy to partner with the Land Trust in applying for funding from U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And we were able to get a controlled burn of the site this past spring. So the entire field was burned by a team of firefighters that came from the Pine Barrens. And now we're looking at potentially a second burn this year, followed by direct seeding in the fall, because the site was in almost 100% non-native grasses. So all that had to go, and they didn't want to use herbicides, nor would I recommend that on such a large property adjacent to homes. So, each site is different. Each site's going to have its own strategy as far as making things happen. The Wet Meadow Toolkit, really essentially our design, if you want to call it that, is just like a changed mowing strategy and a small planting list. So first we mapped out all of the rich plant communities that existed on the site, of which there were many, and then the ways to support them through changing mowing practices and doing some direct seeding and planting. So more of a hands-off approach. And then the Garden and Lawn Toolkit was at the Birches School in Lincoln, and that has been largely installed. Up here on the top is a rendering of what the final design will look like when it's fully grown in. But the site was implemented by about 100 parents and students and volunteers from the community in fall of 2020. So different projects are at different stages of implementation in Lincoln. Opportunities for connectivity, like how do these different designs and these different approaches, make sense across the town or across the region. So here on the left, this is a map of all the properties in Lincoln that have similar landscape attributes to the school project and the Meadow and Woodland project. So all of these properties could have those toolkits. You could essentially go to that page in the plan and follow those directions in that planting design. Here in the middle, same goes, but it's for properties that have similar attributes to the Oldfield Toolkit, the former sheep pasture. And then here on the right, with regards to the Wet Meadow site. So we mapped out, it's basically a roadmap for how individual property owners in the town what steps they could take and which plant lists and which pages in the plan they could follow if they want to implement pollinator habitat or create biodiverse ecosystems. And then here is a map of only those properties in town which have similarities to one of the previously mentioned sites and are within 500 feet of one of the sites where something's already been planted. That initial map I showed at the beginning. So here with a 500-foot buffer on those properties, which represent just a small fraction of the total sites in Lincoln that are suitable for pollinator habitat, you can see the potential for a corridor is quite robust. It's quite interconnected, and it's redundant, quite frankly, which is a good thing. And here's some images of people in Lincoln whose various sites have pollinator habitat installed or are on their way to becoming installed. And teams of students installed some of the plants this past season. Pollinate Northampton is a different project that we did last year, where instead of creating site-specific designs, we created design templates. So they were sort of like imagined designs that would be suitable for replication across the city of Northampton and largely speaking across the wider Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. So we created a sun garden toolkit. Again, this is just like a made up design, but the idea is if you have a sunny area in a town or a city, or even really anywhere in the Connecticut River Valley, and it's about 1,000 square feet, here's what you could plant. And here's a way to consider laying it out. And here's your plant list. So it's really a how-to, and you can also download this online for free. Just Google Pollinate Northampton Toolkit. Also, everything I'm showing tonight is on our website. That's probably an easier place to go. You just go to landscapeinteractions.com/services. And I've got the links to all these projects for free download. The sidewalk strip toolkit was obviously a sidewalk strip. So it's going to be full sun, very dry, and roughly 200 square feet. And then we have the plant list for that. And we also did a bee and butterfly lawn toolkit. So the idea would be if you want to keep your lawn, but you want to do something other than just have a lawn, here's some plants you could insert into your lawn, and here's ways that you could care for it. And here's the kind of nesting habitat you want to create. You want to, clear about 4 inches of grass and soil, replace the soil with about 50% sand, keep it clear of vegetation, and, put it next to native bunching grasses and sedges so that ground nesting bees can get inside that and burrow and create their nest. Another project we did in Connecticut, the McKean Farm Toolkit, just another example of one of our projects. So these were the existing conditions of the site, and we created a four zone design. We had a hedgerow, an upper meadow, a lower meadow, and a wet meadow. I'm going to zip along here because I think we're taking a pretty long time. So these were the project context. This is what the site looked like at the beginning. Their hedgerow was filled with tons of invasives: oriental bittersweet, barberry, multiflora rose. And then you can see on the right here at the top, they removed everything except for a few fruit trees that were buried among the mess. And then here's our list of at-risk pollinators that are supported by the design. And then here's the final design. So we basically recreated the entire hedgerow using exclusively native trees, shrubs, flowers, grasses, and sedges. Keeping the rock wall in the middle, the historic rock wall. All that grassy area you saw at the first photo, that's been smothered and replaced with the meadow seed mix we created custom for the site. And we expanded the hedgerow along the other perimeters of the site with additional plants, willows, and northern bush honeysuckle. We have here the same diagram for the bee nesting strip, which we recommend for all of our sites. And here's a rendering or a section of what an area of the site would look like, cutting across the hedgerow, the mowed path, and the meadow. So you can see here moving from A to A1, you have the hedgerow going to the mowed path and the meadow. And that gives people sort of some idea of what this is actually going to look like on the ground rather than just from above, a sense of scale, a sense of texture and color. We try to include best management practices with all of our projects so that people can, kind of have a concept of what to do, what not to do. And we even have detailed guidelines in most of our projects now for how to actually create and establish a meadow. So this is also available on our website. The Green Corridor Pollinator Toolkit was a project we did in Westport, Connecticut, and it was looking at more of like a highly designed garden or like public park. So it had 6 design areas, and I'm going to zoom in here to the sun and shade garden. So this is a zoom in of that. You can see here, this looks a lot different from some of the other projects we did. It's very designy, it's very formal, a lot of the same plants in swales or in these sort of drifts or bunches, and a red bud in the middle with some seating. This was essentially a really dry gravel courtyard, and we dug everything out and regraded it. And all of this was installed by myself and a team of volunteers across 2 days in May of last year. We're excited to see what species arrive as a result. And here's the plant schedule. So this is all the plants that went into just that courtyard. It's an insane number of plants. I think they had something like 6,000 plants that went in, and it was a lot of work, and it was really hot when we did our planting, but they put in irrigation and everything's doing really well. And here's a rendering of what that site will look like when it's grown in. You can see the forest in the distance. That's the existing conditions of the site in the background. And the direction that we're looking at is looking from the center of the courtyard towards the southeast. And then for that plan, we gave some detailed instructions on not only how to do a meadow, but also how to do a pollinator lawn, because they had that need as well. And another project we did in the Berkshires, the Egremont Pollinator Pathway. What I think was so cool about that project was all the volunteers that came out to install it. We were all, out there in the rain, putting this all in. This all went in again over the course of 2 days. It starts from a parking lot. It has an upland area and a wet meadow area. And then they removed all of these invasives around an ash tree, and we replanted that. And here's the final design, as well as renderings of what the final design would look like. So you can see here the before and after. This is the same picture right over here and down here, showing the design before and after it grows in or was installed. So I'm nearing towards the end here. I'm just going to give you guys a little taste of some of the other work that we're doing. Grazing for Biodiversity was a project that we did for 2 seasons, looking at the impact of rotational livestock grazing on native plant communities. And so after a season of grazing, we burned the field with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And then we allowed the animals to come back in and graze it. And you can see here at the bottom right, the results of that 1.5 years of grazing and 1 year of burning. I mean, it was insane, the way that the plant species composition changed. It was like all little blue stem, Indian grass, goldenrod, aster, milkweed, and that's without planting anything. That's just from the burn and the graze. And now we're going to be doing a seeding of that field. I'm actually about to do the seeding this month. So the field is this whole area here. And for the study, what we sampled were these areas in the dashed lines. That represents the areas that are part of the study, representing different types of soils, different types of light and moisture levels. And then these areas in color are where the animals grazed. In each of these color blocks, they were moving through this 1 week period. So we had week 1, week 2, all the way to week 6, and then they would go back up to the top of the hill and go back down again. And so it gave each field a 6-week rest in between grazing. And these were all the areas that were sampled for vegetation over the 2021 growing season. And so we haven't gone through all the data yet, but what we found in the meantime is that here's just a list of the native plants that existed in the field, were able to fully flower and produce seed and have the animals grazing right alongside them. So we're really challenging the the approach that most livestock managers and farmers have of, only putting their animals or mostly putting their animals out onto these areas that are like, almost entirely agricultural or non-native grasses. In fact, these animals, which I recently butchered, and let me tell you, they were really heavy. I think some of the sheep were like almost 200 pounds. They were eating grasses in between things like milkweed and spirea and Indian grass and Pennsylvania sedge and St. John's wort and common self-heal and native blackberries and even willow. So those plants are not toxic to these animals. They know how to go around them. And in fact, in some cases they browse them, but they don't browse them to the extent where they don't produce seeds and fruit. So they're still supporting pollinators. Pollinator-friendly solar is another area of work that we do. And this is one of our sites in the Berkshire Plateau right after the panels were installed, before we did any planting. So you can see these are really large arrays. Some of them are upwards of 20 to 40 acres. And what's great about Massachusetts is that we have a pollinator-friendly adder as part of the SMART program. So the state actually incentivizes solar companies and solar project owners at the rate of $3,500 per megawatt per year for establishing and maintaining pollinator habitat on those sites. But in order to do so, it has to be certified by UMass Amherst Clean Energy Extension. So it's not just a matter of putting in some flowers. Each site has to have a multi-year habitat establishment and maintenance plan. They must be surveyed by a botanist or other ecological professional before any plants are recommended or installed. At least 33% of the plants in the seed mixes and the screens have to support pollen specialist bees and or Lepidoptera of conservation concern, and the list goes on. And we provide all of these services here on our sites. And to date, Landscape Interactions has helped 28 large-scale solar sites be certified as pollinator friendly in Massachusetts. And in fact, I believe there's only been 34 sites certified to date. So we've brought over 75% of the plans that have been certified forward and approved at our small company. So in order to measure the success of our sites, our goal really is to improve the functional diversity over time. And we use usually native bumblebee species as a metric of success or failure. So if there's more of a diversity of species after the plants and seeds are installed than before, and we've specifically attracted and sustained at-risk species on the site, meaning that they weren't just observed once, but they were observed repeatedly year after year, then that site is considered a successful project. It is functional biodiverse habitat for pollinators and other species. And that's why every one of our projects doesn't just have a design, it also has a maintenance plan and a management regime. I encourage all of you to check out Beecology. It's a web app where you can download, you can upload photos and videos you take on your smartphone or tablet, and they will be positively identified by Dr. Jagir in his lab at UMass Dartmouth. It's a great way to engage people in native bumblebee observations, and much more accurate than things like iNaturalist for observing and identifying bees and their interactions with flowers. So you can get that at beecology.wpi.edu. And here's a map of bumblebee observations across the Northeast as of 2020. So you can see here, some areas are much more diverse than others. We're getting more observations from some areas than others. And here's our website, landscapeinteractions.com. So you can reach out to me there if you have any questions or comments that are not addressed in the Q&A. And I hand it over to Colleen and Suzanne. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Evan. This is great to learn more about your work and how you are packaging things together and really making it palatable for the public and for municipalities to kind of buy in on the messaging. So we greatly appreciate that. If you want to stop your screen share, we can invite the participants if they have any questions. And as usual in our virtual events, if people aren't comfortable asking questions and would like me to ask the question on their behalf, feel free to drop it in the chat. You can either direct message me in the chat, or you can put it in the group chat, and I'm happy to read those out loud. And you're welcome to also, I don't know, what do we call that? Unblind your video if you would like to join us on screen. So we greatly appreciate that. You can either simply unmute yourself, raise your physical hand, or raise your virtual hand, and I will kind of moderate things from there. Suzanne, do you have anything to add to that kind of ground rules?
I think you're good.
Awesome. All right, with that, we'll open up our questions from the participants. Anybody want to get us started? Ryan, welcome.
Hello. First of all, super awesome stuff. Evan, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. Just really appreciate hearing your perspective on it. Wanted to go straight to something juicy here. Leave the leaves. Do you have any experience with either engaging municipal public works organizations who are responsible for, leaf clearing or not on public space, or landscapers who do it on private land? And, is that important? And how do you engage communities to try to change behavior around fall cleanup?
Yeah, it is important. One of the slides I showed had like a list of best management practices, which is something that's pretty standard for us in all of our designs and plans. And one of the recommendations in that is to, leave leaves when possible until the spring, and to wait until average nighttime temperatures are above 50 degrees at least 2 days in a row before you start raking or removing them. The thing is, there's only so much I can do in writing these recommendations or creating these plans. The real sort of effort is in the public education and awareness that comes as a result of these projects. And so that's usually in the hands of the various partners that we work with when we're doing these projects. So like people like the Lincoln Land Conservation Trust, or the Ridgefield Conservation Commission, or the Egremont Agricultural Commission. They're the ones that really have to do the lifting as far as getting the word out. In some cases, we are engaged beyond the project to like keep showing up and talking to people, or like having meetings. I think that the best way to do it is probably to have meetings from the beginning to the end with the people in charge of the various sites. So like if it's a public park that's being taken care of by a Parks and Rec department or a school, you want to make sure that the school maintenance staff are going to the meetings, that they're engaged in the project, that they're excited or at least made aware that this is happening, so that something just doesn't just fall into their lap and they're expected to basically do it. Each project needs to have like local cheerleaders and people that are going to follow through. But it's certainly something that I include in the documentation that I create, which is published. I just can't go out to every site and tell people what to do all the time.
Awesome. Thanks, Evan. Tony, Ryan, does that clear everything up for you? You good? If you are, you can lower your hand, and I'm going to let Tony go ahead and ask her question.
Hi, Evan. Thank you. That was a great presentation, and I love your website. I was looking at it the other day. I guess my question is, I'm just curious about what you think, say, you could offer for Swampscott. Unlike Lincoln, we're only a few square miles with very little open space. And so I was just curious as to how you might approach, if the town, say, was to hire you, what you might, how you might approach coming up with a plan for Swampscott.
Yeah, the way I would do it is, well, the way I like to do it, obviously, ultimately, it's going to be up to the citizens or the, people that are driving the project. But the way I recommend doing it and sort of like the way I approach these projects is to first have a meeting or several meetings and talk about what people's goals are. What do you want to do? And, in some cases, people might say, we just want this like one property to be this. But in most cases, what they really want is for everyone to see it and to be inspired by it, and then to do it on their own site or on their own property or in their own town. And so public visibility is so important when we're doing these regional projects. If you do these projects, if you do these sites where it's like buried and you can't get to the site, maybe there's like no direct parking or like the trail is hard to find, which is some of the challenges we've had in Lincoln with the Chapman pasture. Like there's no parking, there's really no direct trail network without walking for 15 minutes. It's really hard to make that like this emblematic, this is what this pollinator project's about sort of a thing. So I would recommend in a small town, at least one of the sites that you would start with would be highly visible. And then beyond that, if you're going to pick a second site or a third site, pick at least one site where you can do a sizable amount of changes, because you're not going to attract really any species unless you have a certain amount of change. And like we tend to quantify it at the level of, you need at least like a square meter of a plant species on a site. Like, you can't just have like one flower of X species, because the reason why we pick these certain species and the reason why we combine them in this way is because they're all offering a different function. Some of them are blooming in April or May or June, July, all the way to October. Some of them are attracting long-tongued bumblebees. Some of them are host plants for butterflies or moths. Some are nesting habitat for bees or even other animals. And so it's the combination of all of these things that allows this site to attract these species and sustain them. And that's when you get the network. And that's when you get not just pollinators, but also birds, because birds eat pollinators. They eat the caterpillars and they also eat the seeds and the fruit that the pollinators create when they pollinate a plant. So we tend to recommend converting at least 20,000 square feet per site, if possible, in order to make a sizable difference. So if you have a site where you can't even take 20,000 square feet and change it, that might still be a good site for public awareness, like if it's like in front of a municipal building or a library or something, but you're not actually going to be able to do like a research showing a before and after difference unless you've got at least 20,000 square feet. So what I would recommend is either doing several small projects, several small properties that are all within like 500 feet or maybe like 800 feet of each other, that they can be like micro habitats that connect, or at least pick one site that's going to be 20,000 square feet of change, which is really not that much. It's just like a couple of large vegetable gardens strung together. If you're in a small town, you might want to pick a conservation property, a property where certainly budget is going to be a consideration. You want to pick a property where, number one, the landowner is okay with you doing this. Number two, there's a budget that's going to pay for the plants and the labor that's going to have to take care of it. Or you're going to have your volunteers lined up to do the weeding for the first 3 growing seasons. So those are all the considerations that I try to bring forward. And then once you're sort of past those questions, then you're into the realm of, well, what kind of a landscape is this? What's growing there now? What's the invasive species pressure like? I mean, if it's like a jungle of invasive species and there's nothing else growing there, maybe that's not the best site for your like number one site to pick, because it's going to be like an uphill battle. You're going to have a lot of failure battling those invasives, and it might not look good. You might want to pick something that's like kind of like a low-hanging fruit, an easy win. Those are all sort of, topics that I ask people to consider.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Awesome. I see Samantha has a question next, and we'll go there. Just before we do, I just wanted to point out that I did do some live annotating as the talk was going on. So if people are looking for links, please scroll through the chat as I put both some of the direct links that Evan was referencing, as well as some additional resources on tangential topics. And I also just wanted to point out that on our YouTube channel, there are links to all of our past talks, which include the one with Richard Primack, which was referenced in terms of the Concord and species change. And also there's our Doug Talamay talk, which makes some great references to native oaks. And then finally, we had Pete Mara, the bird guy, who actually has done some of the research with bird decline. So all of those are on there if you are interested in those topics as well. Samantha, go ahead.
Thank you, Colleen. Evan, thanks. That was really great presentation. Really enjoyed hearing it. I guess the question I have is not just for you, Evan, but anyone in here. With a lot of these projects, when you say like, oh, we're going to increase insect habitat and increase pollinators, like some people just don't want that. Like they don't want bugs. They don't want to think that more bees are going to be around them. Like, what do you do? I mean, I guess it's a bigger argument about humans' relationship with nature and ecology, but at the end of the day, like some people just don't want this. So that's all.
Yeah, I mean, well, one myth that I try to dispel is that, native bees are going to sting everyone. It's really not true. Most of them are actually averse to even being near people. The one exception is really, ground nesting, like yellow jackets and stuff, which are not target species for our project. So, if they're there, they're going to be there regardless of whether we do this planting. We're really attracting bumblebees, other at-risk bees, and butterflies, and in some cases moths where we have data. So, I don't really think getting stung is a concern. I think honeybees stinging people is more of an issue because they do tend to sting more. But, broadly, if someone has an issue with insects and they are, afraid or against this, well, number one, they're not going to be contacting me to do a pollinator project for them, or they're going to, ask me that question that you did, and then I'm just going to give them the same answer that I gave, which is that most native bees, just don't really, most native bees are not out to sting people, and it's actually pretty rare, with the exception of like stepping on like a yellow jacket or wasp nest. So I think, more and more people are excited about this rather than scared. And, we've done a lot of project with schools and with school kids planting these plants. And it just doesn't seem to be a big issue nowadays, thankfully.
Samantha, you're part of the project at Salem State, correct?
No, I just saw this on LinkedIn.
Oh, okay. Then never mind. I was going to have a suggestion. I thought you were one of the students that we met with in the fall. I
wish.
Jim, I see that you have your hand up. Do you want to ask a question?
Thank you, Colleen. Evan, thanks for the great presentation. I appreciate it. I wonder if there are differences between the approach that you're taking and the tiny forest or micro forest movement that we're starting to look at for a particular site in Swampscott. Are there philosophical differences or approach differences that you'd like to highlight?
I don't know what you're talking about. Can you be more specific?
Well, I could probably turn to Suzanne for help on that, but it's really developing a tight area of a lot of trees and native trees and shrubs in a small area.
Okay.
In an urban setting.
Well, a lot of deciduous trees are visited by bees. A lot of trees in general are host plants for Lepidoptera. And even some coniferous trees are visited by bees and other pollinators, for whatever reason. But there's not a lot of data And there haven't been many studies that are looking at the species level as far as which species are visiting which trees and why. So there are studies that show, you know, in this tree, we found these bees. That's done because people set up traps, and the trap captures anything that falls into it. So what it doesn't tell you is about behavior. Behavior is exactly what we want to know in order to determine which plants support which species and for what, you know, whether it's pollen, nectar, nesting, or all three. So what Dr. Jagir, who, you know, for those of you who don't know, is my scientific partner at Landscape Interactions, what he endeavors to do, and which I'm very excited about, is to start using drones to study the behavior of these pollinators up in the canopy, because it's just simply difficult to see them, you know, because the way that he studies is by observing them, visiting the flowers. So you go out in the landscape, whatever's in bloom, that's what he's going to look for, to see what the bees and the butterflies and other pollinators are doing. That is difficult to do in a tree because it's so tall. And if you set up like some sort of extensive network of ladders or ropes, by the time you get up there, you're only surveying 1 or 2 trees. There could be a whole forest of them or a whole group of them. And so our data has been limited, since we're interested in behavior, because that's where you start to understand the network is through behavior. Our data has been limited to shorter trees. And that's why we work a lot with things like scrub oak, redbud, willow. Now, it's anecdotally known that maples are widely visited by bumblebees. What we don't know is which maple species are visited by which bumblebee species. And so this could be a great opportunity for research, where if you guys were developing these plots where you had many different species of trees in a given area, you know, one way to go about doing that would be, we could collaborate with you, make recommendations for which species to plant, hopefully get the species at a large enough size where they're going to start blooming within the first couple of years, you know, not just like little whips, and then to start to survey them, because we'd be capturing the data in a pretty rapid way, because the trees would be, you know, comparatively relatively small, you know, if you're planting them from fresh stock. And if these are larger trees, or if you're surveying, or if you're interested in like repopulating areas that already have existing trees, then you could do the drone study, where you fly a drone into the canopy, depending upon what species is blooming, and you see what's visiting it. So that's an opportunity, I think. Otherwise, I would just say anecdotally, without having data to back it up, I would say plant red maple, plant as many native willows as you can, plant as an understory things like low bush blueberry if the soils are wet enough, northern bush honeysuckle, native roses if it gets full sun. You know, the same plants that we do in our designs, plant lots of different oaks. They're important host plants for all kinds of Lepidoptera, even eastern red cedar, that's a host plant for the juniper hairstreak. Atlantic white cedar, if it's a wet area, is a host plant. I'm trying to think what else we've worked. Redbud is incredibly valuable for all kinds of bumblebees. I mean, I can't tell you how many rare bumblebees I've seen in redbuds.
Well, that's very creative and thorough answer. Thanks a lot. You've given us a lot to think about.
Thanks, Jim. Any other questions from our participants? I don't think I've seen anything in the chat sent to me. It seems like we have a chatty group tonight, willing to get out there and talk with us. No. Okay. If that is all from our audience, please join me once again in thanking Evan for sharing his work with landscape interactions and designs with us. You can do a virtual, you can clap along with me, you can do your finger snaps, however you choose to acknowledge and celebrate. Evan, thank you again for joining us this evening. We greatly appreciate the time and energy that you spent with us. Thank you to those in our audience who joined us for this hour and a half this evening. We very much appreciate your support for Conservancy efforts. Again, our membership drive is currently ongoing. We have our bonfire store always open if you would like to support that. And we, as always, encourage you to connect with us both in person, virtually, and of course on iNaturalist to help us document Swampscott's biodiversity. Without you out there helping us to document those species, we wouldn't know what we had here. I'll hang on for a few more minutes if there's any other questions. Evan, if you want to hang for a minute or two, feel free.
Yeah, I want to look at your iNaturalist page, just to see like what's been observed.
Sure.
What is the link to it?
I can drop it in. Hang on one second. But if you just Google iNaturalist and Swampscott Conservancy, you should probably come up with it.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it would be great if you guys were able to upload videos of bumblebees this coming year, because the Beecology app will walk you through the steps and how to identify it to the species level. So it actually teaches you how to identify bumblebees, and then beyond that, it will tell you the identification is verified by real people in Dr. Jagir's lab. Unlike iNaturalist, which is purely AI, and if you're lucky, someone reviews your observation. It's just really hard. iNaturalist isn't quite there yet with the bumblebee observations or identifications. And
well, just to slightly correct, because I do work quite a bit with iNaturalist at the university, and so iNaturalist does verify using human verifications. And there are many taxonomic experts from various museums who are in fact identifying. But I'm happy to share information about bee ecology as well. But I don't want people to think that iNaturalist isn't a good place to hang out. It's definitely a great place to hang out, to learn about local species diversity, to interact with the community who will talk to you on the platform and help you learn how to identify. And also, of course, it is an open science platform, which means the data is open and freely accessible, not just to scientists, but also to everyday citizens who want to ask and answer questions about local biodiversity. So here in Swampscott, if you want to just query and see what species we have, you can simply use the visualization tools on their webpage and see the 300 species of insects that have been documented, etc. So do stay with us on iNaturalist, but yes, of course, if you are interested in documenting further, bee ecology is a great place to kind of take those skills to the next step. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording, but yeah, feel free to hang on if there's any other questions.